if you want to use a religious analogy, it was like the scales fell from my eyes about injustice. And I really understood about exploitation and speciesism. Before that, I didn't. The thing about being a rational human being is that we can rationalize anything. But the one thing I think that even carnivores would agree, is that the factory farm system produces a lot of suffering with animals. I mean, I think there's some basic tenets that all humans could agree on. A pastor said, we're all born with sin. And I just thought, you know what? That's not true. The tenet about Jesus doing the kindest thing has evolved into Ingrid Newkirk, who started PETA. I heard her quote, which is, be kind, be kind, be kind.
Hey, Alexandra, how are you?
Hi, Jamie. I'm very well, thank you. Happy to be speaking with you.
Yeah, likewise. It's great to get the chance to talk to you. And we were introduced by one of my previous guests, Crystal Heath, who kindly put us in touch. And I've been following your story for a while, so it's brilliant to get the chance to have you as a guest on Sentientist Conversations, so we can dig into your sort of philosophical journey and your activism and your view for how we can make a better future too. And so you know this already, but I guess this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest and most important philosophical questions, the questions of, what's real and how should we understand the universe, but just as importantly, the questions of ethics and what matters and who matters and how can we live a good life, or at least a better life. I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize this really simple, pluralistic, hopefully common sense worldview called sentientism. And in a sentence, it's evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So when we're asking the what's real question, it suggests we use evidence and reason, a naturalistic, maybe scientific way of understanding the world. And on the questions of ethics, the clue is in the name, that every sentient being, any being that can feel things, that can suffer, that can flourish, that can experience, should get serious compassion and moral consideration. But I'm talking in these conversations to people who agree and disagree with various aspects of that. So it's going to be fascinating to understand your own thinking. But before we get onto those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself, your life, and your work to those who don't know you already?
My name is Alexandra Paul. I am, by career, a longtime actress. I've been an actress for 41 years. I'm most known for starring on the television series Baywatch, but I have over 100 film and television credits to my name.
You have to scroll quite far through IMDb to get through your amazing list of credits. So,
because I'm old. I'm also going to be 60 next month.
And successful.
Yes, I was very fortunate and loved every job that I had, for sure. And I'm hoping to work more in the future. I'm married to a wonderful man. I've been married I've been with Ian for 27 years, and we're very much in love. I'm very, very fortunate there too. I feel really blessed. And I am an actress by trade, but I feel like I'm an activist. That's the thing that feeds my soul. I love acting, but activism is something that gives me purpose and meaning. And so I've been very involved in many areas of activism. And we can certainly talk about that. And Crystal Heath who introduced us, is an animal activist, and I am an animal activist, but I'm also very much concerned about human population numbers, which is an issue that brings up a lot of ethical questions. So we can definitely go there if you like. Anyway, I've just moved to Ashland, Oregon to be with my mom, who has Parkinson's, and she just needs some more help. So we've moved, Ian and I have moved here, and we really, really like it.
Yeah, it sounds like a wonderful state. One of my previous guests, you may have come across him, David Mickelson, who runs the Yes on IP 13 ballot initiative in Oregon, is doing some fascinating work to try and push the state to, if the ballot initiative goes through, even become a sanctuary state. It would ultimately remove all of the restrictions on animal cruelty legislation, and thereby essentially outlawing cruelty and killing of any animals, including farmed animals. So yeah, that's a fascinating piece of local activism you can plug into if you're not already in touch with those guys.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, that's a brilliant intro. Thank you very much. Let's, and like you say, you've prefigured quite a few of the themes I think we'll touch on. Let's start with the first of these really big philosophical questions, the question of what's real, epistemology, like, if you like, how do we understand the world? And for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up originally in maybe a more religious or a spiritual or a supernaturally minded household and culture, or one that was more naturalistic, maybe agnostic, atheistic, scientifically minded, or something else, and how that side of their thinking has changed through their life, if it has. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like to sort of tell the story of your thinking about how you understand the universe.
I grew up in a Protestant household. We did go to church every Sunday. This was the 60s and 70s. I don't think that was as unusual as it might be today. I also went to a boarding school for high school where we went to church every morning. It was, but there were also people of other religions. There were some Jewish folks who went to chapel in the morning too, because it was kind of not a non-denominational, although they did refer to the Bible a lot. So, which I think Americans do that a lot. Oh, we're non-denominational, but here's the Bible. I'm going to swear. It drives me crazy when our presidents swear on the Bible, because I thought there was a separation of church and state. But anyway.
Yeah, it's a little bit pick and choose, isn't it?
Yeah. Exactly. So I grew up, I was confirmed into the church at age 12. And I remember very distinctly that a tenet that stuck with me was from my confirmation class was, when in doubt, do what Jesus would do, the kindest thing. And that has evolved as I left the church when I was, I guess when I was in a midnight mass around when I was 17 or so, I heard for the first, really got it when the pastor said, we're all born with sin. And I don't know why for the first time I heard that, even though that's repeated over and over in church. And I just thought, you know what, that's not true. That's not true. And I think that was pretty much the end of me and religion. I also felt that religion didn't deal with the things that needed to be done on earth, and like the environment, which was something that very much concerned me as a teenager. So I never went back to church after that. And the tenet about Jesus doing the kindest thing has evolved into Ingrid Newkirk, who started PETA. I heard her quote, which is, be kind, be kind, be kind. And that's really the one that I listen to now. Although I have a lot of respect for Jesus, if he was a real person, I think he did a lot of good things, and his basic idea of the fact that I interpret it as God is within us is valid. But I personally don't have a God. I feel like I've got a lot of work to do on earth. And I actually, as a teenager, went, you know what? I'm not even going to deal with religion because it's just a waste of time. I need to fix things on earth.
Yeah.
So
you've got work to do. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't consider myself a spiritual person.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Thank you. And so it sounds like there was a sense to which you turned away from it because you just didn't see it was relevant to problems that you thought were urgent and important. So it was just didn't really plug into that. And there was a rejection of this suggestion that all of us have, in essence, are bad people in some sense. We're all flawed or broken in some way, and there's a guilt that can come along with that too.
And that we were born that way. Because I believe we get scarred as we go through life, but I still don't believe that makes us sinners.
Yeah. Did you see any other challenges in the religious worldview that were a factor there as well? Because my guests, many of them, it's a sort of quite clear facts and evidence and reason thing where they just go, hold on, these stories just don't seem to be true to me and the evidence isn't strong enough. So it's quite a sort of technical fact thing. With other people, depending on which denominations they're in or which religions they're in or which communities they're part of, might see, on the one hand, the good that comes through those religious worldviews, compassion and the golden rule and being kind and caring about others and love, universal love. But then they'll also see some problems, and that might be sexism, homophobia, outgroup discrimination, cruel punishments, bizarre constraints on freedom, the usual sort of list. Were there any things along those lines that made you turn away, or was it more this challenge about sin and it's not really relevant to the problems of today?
Oh no, all that as a teenager. I mean, in terms of religion and Christianity in specifics, I didn't know much about other religions at that time, but I think spirituality is different from religion. I'm sure a lot of your guests have said that. And, of course, the Christian church, the Crusades were horrible. I went to the Vatican also as a tourist, I guess like early 20s maybe, and was horrified at the riches in that place, that all the gold and silver and jewelry that was being displayed, and just horrified. And even had to pay to go to the bathroom there, actually, to use the toilet at that time. I don't know if that's still the case, but so it just rubbed me the wrong way. And also the anthropocentric view of the Bible, which is that humans are the center and we have dominion over everything else, which I know some people interpret in different ways, but still the Bible is certainly very anthropocentric and very male dominated.
Yeah, it's a particular part of humanity that tends to get privileged in a hierarchy, isn't it? And as you hinted there, I think there are people doing great work in many religious communities trying to challenge that anthropocentrism. So in the Christian worldview, for example, people are trying to shift away from a focus on dominion to one of stewardship and caring and extending universal compassion to non-humans and so on. And, all power to them. That's great. But the default is pretty clear, right? There's a hierarchy and there's God at the top, and then there's normally powerful, in-group males at the next level. Then there's all of the other humans, then there's the out-group humans, and then there's basically anyone and anything else that sits underneath that. And that's not the only way humans build oppressive hierarchies, but it's one of them, right? So yeah, and it's one that you can't challenge because by definition, it's in the books, and that's the answer. So yeah,
I have done activism with the Catholic workers, and I think they very much put into practice what is talked about in the Bible about loving your fellow man, a fellow human. And so I respect them. I was protesting the Iraq War in 2003 here in Los Angeles with the Catholic workers, and was arrested several times with them. And they've taught me a lot about how to be a better activist, for sure. Yeah.
And I think that's one thing. I mean, I framed this sentientism idea as explicitly naturalistic, and some people will say, well, doesn't that exclude people with a supernatural or religious worldview? And I said, well, it does in the sense of a term that describes it, but that doesn't mean we don't work with people regardless of their worldview. So I'm a strong proponent of freedom of religion, freedom of belief. And if, we have common cause with people of different worldviews, we should work together to push forward on those agendas. Absolutely. And people, many of whom disagree with me in a radical way, still have common cause over some of the things we want to try and make happen in the world. So we shouldn't fall into another one of those sort of groupish exclusive traps because of the fact that some people have a naturalistic and some people have a supernatural worldview. So yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I think that religion and being in a church, belonging to a church, offered apparently a lot of solace to a lot of people, not only because they gives them meaning to their life, I think, but also because people are less lonely when they're in community. And if they actually do actions of, giving back, et cetera, like the church preaches, then that can give them also more purpose in life.
Yeah, absolutely. There's charitable giving, there's zakat, and there's tithing, and as you said, there's community. There's just getting together every week and with people around you. There's enormous value in them. Now, and I think you could have all of those good things without having to have the supernatural worldviews, but it just so happens that people with religious worldviews are pretty good at organizing that stuff and have a history around it. So it doesn't make sense to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So now,
but having said that, I will not join a religion because of the exclusiveness and the hierarchy and the fact that, humans are at the center, and the environment and nature and animals all come second or third or fourth or something way down.
And it's interesting because there's clearly a massive diversity of different religious beliefs, and many people with a form of religious belief, maybe a more progressive, modern, humanistic, rights-oriented religious belief, will quite easily criticize more extreme versions of religious belief, because the harm and the punishment and the cruelty and the constraints are just so egregious and strong. But it still strikes me as quite interesting that even in the most moderate forms of religion, I think there's still some really awful ethics there. So just the idea of creating a hell where you will torture, vast swathes of beings for eternity doesn't seem like the act of a compassionate being. And then to hold the being that created that hell up as the ultimate ethical role model, just it doesn't seem wise to me, right? But the idea is of hell and heaven aren't universally believed amongst religious people, but many people do. They all hold a deeply progressive, positive worldview in all of life, but then they'll still believe that putting, innocents into hell to be tortured for eternity is by definition a good thing because it's being done by the perfect instantiation of the good. And I just, for many people that's just irrelevant in their lives, but I do worry about what implication that has for human ethics, right? We've got to pick our role models carefully, and that's not a good starting point in my mind.
A friend of mine wrote a song that had a line in it: "Why do we kill people who kill people to show that killing people is wrong?" It just, it's a circuitous thing. And so I don't believe that people are born bad. I believe that there's circumstances and can twist them to do bad things. I did ask somebody who worked in a prison for a long time if he felt that people were born bad, and he said yes, but then he started talking about childhood. So I kind of thought maybe he recognized that humans get damaged and do terrible things because of childhoods, or I'm not sure because I don't know anybody who's like that. I don't know if you've ever interviewed somebody who's a prison guard or anything like that.
I haven't, no.
Been around? Maybe that would be an interesting conversation about people.
Yeah, I mean, I've had some fascinating conversations, and one of the themes that, depends whether you want to go down this rabbit hole, but I quite like the idea of moral luck, where in a sense, particularly if you've got a more scientific, naturalistic worldview, in a sense, almost everything is about our lives is down to luck, right? It's about our DNA and our biology and our upbringing and the circumstances we've been through. And, you can take that all the way through to determinism and denying free will and all sorts of other slightly strange ideas. But in a sense, I think it's quite a progressive way of thinking, because where that takes you, this idea of ultimately we are who we are. And there's, in a sense, there's little point blaming anyone for things, means that I think you strip out a retributive idea where you just, someone does something bad and you hurt them because they did something bad in its pure sense. But you can still have a really rich progressive justice system, because you can still, when it's required, constrain people or harm them if you're doing that because of compassion for the other beings they might harm. So you can still have restorative justice and deterrence, and you can have rationales that can protect others and so on. But, is there really ultimately any value in just hurting someone because they've caused harm to others? And so we're probably going down a philosophical rabbit hole there. But I quite like that idea of, is there really, we can hold people accountable, responsible? Do we blame them? Is there some magical self that could have done otherwise that we should?
I think the punishment thing is mostly as a deterrent, is supposed to try and deter other people from doing the same thing, right? Although I don't think that has really borne out, because certainly the United States is a perfect example where we have the death penalty and we have so many people in jail and we have a lot of crime, violent crime. Obviously, it's not working, our system.
But there are other things you can do. You can rehabilitate people. You can restore the wrong done. And yeah, you may well need to, there's all sorts of problems with incarceration, but sometimes you might well need to do that just to protect others who are at risk of that individual. But you can do that still it's weird, but you can still do that in a way that is compassionate, even for the perpetrator. And that can be one of the most difficult things to do, I think, because our instinctive response often is to, take retribution. But yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
When you talk about luck and how we are as luck, I've always questioned my character. Like how good a person would I be if I weren't born in the circumstances in which I was born, which was someone who never had to fight for food, who never who basically fit in, who has been loved, has never really been violated. I'm not sure. I worried that my character was weak. And I think that's one of the reasons I've become an activist.
You're like overcompensating. I'm definitely going the other way.
I definitely am. Yeah, I do remember being sort of afraid that I was really a bad person underneath. And it was just that I could have done bad things, immoral things, because I would have been swayed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a mature way to think, right? And I think it's all too rare that people consider that possibility and imagine, who they might have been if the circumstances were different. So, yeah, that can help us empathize, I think, too. So, well, that's been fascinating, and you've demonstrated how difficult it is for me to separate this idea of the sort of epistemology and the ethics stuff, because we always get into the ethics really quickly. But that was a fascinating journey around the sort of the religious worldview and then how that's influenced some of your ethical thinking. And you mentioned that you don't consider yourself a spiritual person either, because some people who've left a more formalized religion will reject the institutional structures and the policies and the anthropocentrism and the often sexism and homophobia and so on, but they'll still find some sense of the transcendence or the spiritual or something wider that they still identify with, even though they've rejected all of the formal structures of the church. But you haven't felt drawn to that sort of spiritual path yourself?
I feel like it's too much about me. And though I do believe that it doesn't make logical sense that there aren't other beings out in the universe, for example, although that's not a spiritual belief, but it sort of seems too small for it just to be us when there's so much out there.
It's a big universe. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I also, I do think it distracts from what's actually the pain and suffering that animals and people are feeling now.
Yeah.
So that's why I don't have much interest in spirituality.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So quite often in this What's Real question, we do talk about religion and spirituality and the supernatural. But there's another space I really wanted to talk to you about under this heading, and that is the world of health and well-being generally, because you're a qualified health coach, and that's one of the major themes of your Switch for Good podcast and so on. And I find the health space fascinating because I'm a total amateur. I had a can of cold baked beans for lunch, so don't come to me looking for diet tips or health tips. But
baked beans are good.
Well, yeah, exactly. I could probably get a bit more balance, but it's not bad if I'm going to pick one thing. But there's the health space is, I think, particularly interesting for people like you and me who are serious about animal activism and veganism, because there's a danger of wishful thinking in the health space for us, I think, because we see the ethical horror, for example, of animal agriculture, and there's a degree to which we want to believe, therefore, that, for example, plant-based whole food diets are therefore really healthy, because wouldn't that be convenient? Because it helps build an argument that rejects the thing we think is ethically horrific. So I guess that's one thing that I think we all need to watch for, is that wishful thinking, even if it's based on good motives. But in the health space and the well-being, the wellness space overall, it also seems that there's a dangerous slippage that I see some people taking, where they might start from, an understandable and correct healthy skepticism of standard mainstream medicine and pharmacological interventions, and maybe a worry of things are getting over-medicalized. They have this sensible approach to lifestyle medicine and thinking about, look, we need to eat well and sleep well and be active and take a more holistic approach to living positive lives. But they can slip from those sort of extremely reasonable, well-founded, I think, beliefs about how to live a good life and to look after ourselves into some quite dangerous and dark places. And that can involve anti-vax movements. It can involve people overstating claims for veganism and plant-based diets, such that, people might say, I think veganism can cure my cancer, so I don't need to listen to my doctor's advice about the radiotherapy or the chemotherapy. People might go down paths where they think that ultimately, the power of positive thinking might have almost magical results for them, such that if you manifest correctly, your life and your health will go brilliantly. And then, of course, if things don't go brilliantly, guess whose fault it is? It's your fault that you haven't manifested correctly. And people end up, switching away from traditional medicines and end up spending loads of money on supplements sold by grifters on YouTube. I should stop rambling on, but that's sort of my sense about how there's loads of good stuff going on in the health and wellness space, but there's also these dangerous parts where either for wishful thinking or for other reasons and other motivations, a lot of people seem to end up in quite a dangerous place based on just getting things wrong. What's your sense overall of that sort of big picture about the good and bad of the wellness and health spaces?
Well, I think with anything, humans do that. I mean, we do that with eating meat too. Look at confined animal operations. That is going way too far in that direction too. So we have to remember that's just kind of human nature to well, we all make mistakes, and the health community was targeted by algorithms on Facebook about anti-vax. I'm not enough on Facebook to have been targeted, but I also do believe in science, and respect it. And although I don't get a flu shot every year because I figure, well, I really don't want, there's a little bit of like, I don't really want that stuff inside me. If I don't have to, I have gotten 3 or 4 vaccines for COVID and have never gotten COVID because I'm still wearing a mask when I fly. And I just stopped wearing a mask last week in stores. So I am very cautious and believe that it is airborne. And I kind of believe, I believe in the science of what, Dr. Fauci said, which a lot of my vegan friends think Dr. Fauci is terrible. So the devil, one of them is the devil. So,
wow.
I do recognize, and I believe it's because they were looking at different information. It's tough. It's the environment that we're in. But having said that specifically about veganism, I don't know if being plant exclusive is a lot healthier than eating meat and dairy. But I'm pretty clear that dairy is bad for you. I also am clear that red meat has a lot of issues. I mean, just because of the fact that they're fed so many antibiotics and they're highly inflammatory. But if you have some of it, I don't think it's going to hurt, maybe. What trumps it for me is, because I'm an ethical vegan, is that it just causes so much suffering to animals. And if you don't care about animals, it also causes a lot of problems with climate change. And if you don't care about climate change, but you care about humans, it really is an inefficient way to feed humans, and your children and grandchildren will not have, very likely, enough food, especially if the population keeps growing as it is, if we continue to focus so much on having a meat-based diet.
Yeah. So those motivations are clear. Thank you. And I'm with you on that approach. It is difficult because, who are you and I to know all of the details of these scientific studies and everything that's going on? It's a good baseline generally to accept that the scientific consensus is probably pretty solid for a real reason, but that never means it's perfect, and it is shifting over time.
I think the consensus between everybody, except for the carnivores, is that eating plants is good. I think every diet.
They tell me that plants are poisonous.
The carnivores?
Yeah.
But I would like to know where they're getting their fiber, and if they're incredibly constipated. That's what I really want to know. And I'd like to see their lipid panels, their cholesterol and triglycerides, things like that, because but they I don't know if they show them, and they probably would say, oh, it doesn't matter anyway. So the thing about being a rational human being is that we can rationalize anything. But the one thing I think that even carnivores would agree, is that the factory farm system produces a lot of suffering with animals. I mean, I think there's some basic tenets that all humans could agree on. Some of them would say, yeah, but it's worth it because we need cheap food. But I think they'd all agree that it's not a system that they're comfortable with.
It's pretty rare, isn't it? Yeah. And I think that's the right approach on the health front is essentially take a scientific approach, be open-minded, be clear, follow the evidence, try not to get groupish or tribal about which direction things are going in, partly because that's likely to take us to a better outcome, but partly because I think it also improves our credibility when we do make claims that are backed up by scientific evidence. And as you said, we don't need to overstate, because there are actually some quite well-founded disbenefits to animal products and some quite clear, well-framed, caveated benefits to plant-based eating too. So no, I'm completely with you on that. So let's come on to that next big question about what matters and who matters. And it's an interesting question for someone who doesn't have a religious worldview, because, as you said, when you grow up in a religious context, the ethics come as part of the package. You have what would Jesus do, you have the commandments and so on. And as you move away from a religious worldview, it can be quite an interesting question to say, okay, well, what do I base my morality on now? And you've already talked about the fact that you've taken some of those aspects about compassion and Ingrid's be kind, be kind, be kind. So it feels like that's the sort of the simple baseline for your ethics. Is there anything else you'd add to, what do you think of good and bad and right and wrong even mean, or is it really that simple, which I like?
I think kindness is not good or bad or wrong or right. It just is. It's like, to me, it's so clear. I think we all know what kindness is and what suffering looks like.
Yeah, it's sort of almost self-evident to any common sense definition of ethics, isn't it? I mean, what is ethics if it's not how we care about others? And if we care about others, we should want to be kind.
Well, I mean, I guess I think we complicate it as just be kind. Be kind, and you will be an ethical person. You sometimes can't be 100% kind, and that's when you have to weigh things. And I remember for my wedding, I wore a dress that was not made of, it was made of like some nylon fake stuff. It wasn't cotton, and it wasn't, but it definitely wasn't silk or wool, which most dresses are probably silk if they're high end, but it was some, man-made material. And somebody wrote to me and said, you're a hypocrite because you're an environmentalist and you just wore something made from, byproduct of oil. And I said, you're right. I did, but I weighed it, and I have waited, and I believe that the suffering of animals is more important to me than the environmental issue here. So it's, you do have to think about things, but I think that's my guiding principle, is just to be kind. And then everything kind of falls into place. It doesn't kind of, it does. It falls into place. It really does if you follow that. Sometimes not easy.
No, it doesn't mean you naturally have a perfect answer to every dilemma, but as a starting point.
I see people here begging, and sometimes I don't want to give money or food to them. I usually keep protein bars in my car to give to people, but sometimes I don't. And I think to myself, Alexandra, what is wrong with you? What's going on? And then there's all the justifications, which is, well, I'm not helping them pull themselves up if I give them and I don't know, the truth is that I'm not doing the kindest thing when I don't give it to them, because who am I to judge? I sometimes wonder, we look back on different generations and say, oh, I can't believe they were so homophobic, or they were so misogynistic, or they treated, I believe that in a few decades, we'll look back and be horrified at how we treat animals. I often think to myself, what am I doing now that I'm going to be horrified at in 20 years? And I think some of the conceptions that I have, even though I volunteered for 10 years feeding folks who are houseless, that I have still some judgment, like, of why they're houseless. And I don't like that part of me. So and I'm very aware that I'm not being kind at that moment. So even though that's my principle, I'm not telling you that I always follow it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And the second part of the question is who matters? Because I think many people would agree with you, right? Be kind, of course, that's central to ethics. But most humans around the world would restrict that kindness in various ways. They might restrict it to a certain group of humans. They might try and extend it, at least logically, to all humans. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights or similar ideas. Of course, we've never implemented it, but at least in concept, people would say, yes, all humans matter. So I'm interested in your journey about how you thought about that sort of idea of moral scope or the moral circle and expanding that. And one of the critical points for many of my guests is how and when they came to think seriously about non-human sentient beings, animals too. So what was your story there in terms of, again, you can go back as early as you like to find the first seeds of how you were thinking about moral scope and who gets to count.
Well, when I was a kid, I thought everybody counted. And just because I believed, I mean, if I examined it, I think I would have said to you, well, everybody counts. Now I recognize that there's a speciesism inside me and a hierarchy in terms of people whom I would save if I had to triage. So there is a hierarchy in terms of how I can, if I had to choose, how I would dispense my kindness. I believe that kindness is, I wouldn't want to do anybody harm, but sometimes by neglect, you can harm somebody. So when I'm not, there's that moral question, Peter Singer, with whom you've spoken, is such a genius, but, do we give our dollar to the person on the street? Or do we give here in Ashland, Oregon, or do I give it to the person in Africa for whom a dollar would be able to feed the entire family? That's effective altruism, I guess. I've always been had a theory that you give it to who's in your front of you because they suffer. I'm not going to try and calculate the effectiveness of my kindness. I'm just going to be kind, whatever's in front of me. I loved animals. My mother was British, is British. And she grew up in World War II and came very much from an ethic of not wasting anything. And so we recycled and we turned off lights, very un-American of us in the 60s and 70s, actually, where people were busy, starting to throw things away and starting to eat fast food and things.
Bigger and bigger cars, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we just always had that ethic of saving and being thoughtful. And she also volunteered a lot. My mom, she gave blood and she volunteered her time at the church and with children, et cetera, et cetera. So I saw her and that was my ethic, was you help people and you also save resources. Now, her reason for saving resources is because of the war. And it wasn't, but mine became, because it was the 70s, an environmental. You save resources because the earth is finite. So I interpreted it a little differently than my mom did. And that was really the start of me caring about the environment. And then I read Peter Singer's book. Well, I became a vegetarian because of the environment. I read a book called Diet for a Small Planet by Frances Moore Lepay. And have you interviewed her? She probably
I haven't, no. I would love to, yeah.
Diet for a Small Planet, which really talked about not becoming a vegetarian for environmental reasons. And so I became a vegetarian when I was 14. And then when I read Peter Singer's book when I was 16, I widened my view of why it would be good to be vegetarian to animals. Before that, I never thought about it. I grew up in the country, but I never thought that about the larger issues of confining animals. I mean, I didn't want them. I wanted them to run free in fields where they mostly did around me, but I didn't think about the more existential issues of is it right for them to even be confined at all, or for us to take their milk and things like that. So I became more aware of veganism and not exploiting animals, not just merely being a vegetarian so they're not killed. And started in my 20s, gave up wearing animals, leather, wool, and silk, which was not easy in the 80s, by the way, especially being an actress in the 80s. I had it in my contract, my acting contracts, that since I was like 21, that no makeup could be tested on animals, which was also, actually, the makeup artists were always really positive. I never had a negative issue, even though there was only one company, MAC, And they're Joe Blasco that didn't test on animals, that you knew, sort of everybody knew. Now, unfortunately, Mac does test on animals because of China and its mandates. If you want to sell in China, you have to do some testing. But back then they didn't. So yeah, so it was a progression. And I didn't become vegan until I was, till 33 years later after I turned vegetarian. I didn't actually become vegan. And when I did become vegan, it changed I did change as a person a lot. You'd think, no, Alexandra's given up everything except for some, frozen yogurt and some cheese and a Caesar salad. Cause, but when I did give those things up, it was really big in terms of how I viewed the world. It was like this, if you want to use a religious analogy, it was like the scales fell from my eyes about injustice. And I really understood about exploitation and speciesism. Before that, I didn't.
Yeah, it was just a different lens and a different level of clarity. And it's interesting because in the conversations I have here, quite often there does seem to be quite a strong parallel between this idea of, for some people moving away from a religious worldview to a naturalistic worldview can feel like the scales fall away from their eyes and they see things clearly and the whole world's changed and they can't understand really the person they were before. And it can feel similar on the animal ethics topic too, I think, where you've just grown up thinking certain things are completely normal and you just don't think about them. And then all of a sudden, it feels like you're living in an alien world and it's difficult to understand the person you were before. So I probably overplay the parallels, but sometimes it feels like they're there. And what was it? So you talked a little bit about the practicalities, and obviously things are easier now, generally, particularly in the US, than they were in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on. But what did it feel like in the showbiz world in general, making those changes? Were people generally supportive, or were you challenged, or were you seen as bizarre or odd or unusual? Or how's that? How do you think that's shifted over time?
I don't remember if I was seen as, I never really cared. I was never really someone who never drank alcohol, and I've never felt like I should at parties or bars. I just never did. And a lot of people I hear, and they always surprise me, they feel really pressured, like they stick out if they don't. So I guess I never really thought about that I stick out, and it was always fine for me to say, I'm sorry, don't eat that. Or, on sets, there was one of my first feature film, actually, I had to eat a hamburger and I just pushed the burger away and, ate the bun. And now I would probably ask that it be changed to something else, that I wouldn't really want to promote the eating of a burger. But back then I just, so it wasn't really an issue. And I remember when I was on Baywatch, I asked, the producers had asked me they'd written my character in on an episode to go with Pamela Anderson's character to SeaWorld. And I asked them to take me out because I didn't want to promote SeaWorld. And by the way, Pamela Anderson is an amazing animal activist, but right then now I know she wouldn't go to SeaWorld, but then she just didn't, I don't even know if she was a vegetarian, but she remained in that scene, but now I know she wouldn't. And, we all have our journeys. So, and that was probably definitely an oddball request. In the early 90s, people weren't really looking at SeaWorld and marine land and all those and aquariums as terrible places. But the producers were very respectful because they knew I already had it in my acting contract not to test on animals. So they already knew that it was a values thing and not me being a diva. So I think people respect it if you ask in a way that it just explains, your feelings. And yeah, so I've done that several times in films. And I did one film, was working on a film in Bulgaria, and they wanted me to ride a horse. And I don't ride horses, and I don't, actually, that has evolved too. I would never have thought about that as a teenager. I rode horses a lot. We had horses, but I told them I couldn't do that scene. I couldn't. And so if they couldn't change it, I was playing the lead. I couldn't be in their movie. And I suggested other scenarios that would not entail any animals. And so they agreed. We used a motorcycle instead, because there was supposed to be some horse stampede or something. And I'm thinking, the horse stampede? Good luck. This is not, a Tom Cruise budget movie. And afterwards, the director told me, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad that we changed it, because that horse thing would have been really, really hard to do."
You saved him a whole world of pain.
Yeah. I did.
That's brilliant. Thank you. So, so it's quite clear that you had that childhood, you cared about animals in that sense, but then it took a while to make that connection, and eventually the journey took you to veganism, and then it felt like you got that clarity. How do you think about that question of who matters? Do you think about it in the classic sort of vegan definition of all animals? I tend to also focus on this idea of sentience being the capacity to suffer and flourish, and they basically overlap. I think the main reason people care about animals is because those animals can suffer, and that matters to us. But do you find that term sentience useful, or is it a distraction from the animal question? Or
I do. That's how I always find it so interesting when people will, in fact, someone did this just a couple of days ago where I said something, we were talking about animals and veganism probably. And she said something about, well, they're so smart. Pigs are so smart. And I thought, that has absolutely nothing to do with my, and Peter Singer, of course, clarifies this a lot, is that there are a lot of animals. Well, gosh, I mean, intelligence, the way we rate intelligence is just so ridiculous. It's only based on, well, a long time ago when white men were the ones who decided what intelligence was, and their intelligence tests, IQ tests and everything. They just rated it according to how they did, and so it's so subjective. And when you hear that, octopi can see different colors, and there's so many ways animals are so much more gifted than we are, but we of course totally dismiss those ways and just want to know how well they do on a math test. So I don't take intelligence at all, but I still notice I have a hierarchy. And for example, this morning I'm having an ant issue in my house, and so I sweep up the ants instead of, I don't kill them, and I deter them by putting things down. And I also have to talk to myself, like, who cares if there's little ants on my counter? Okay, people are saying it's really dirty. I mean, has it ever killed me? No, it's just my story around the ants. And so I'm sweeping them, but I notice that I don't really care if some of them die when I'm sweeping. I don't. I have to admit that. So I was thinking just this morning, wow, Alexandra, you have a hierarchy for sure. But I don't kill ants. Although I have to say, it's really hard. Yeah, well, I live in a rented house right now, but I did own my house in LA. We have tented our house, which means killing all the termites because it was so termite ridden. That was I did that because it worked for me. I killed a whole bunch of termites.
No, and I think that's part of the challenge, right? There's no perfect way to live a life. It's probably impossible to live a life without causing some sort of harm or even death to others. But the fact that we can't be perfect doesn't mean we don't try at all. And I think the other interesting thing is the way I've tried to frame this sentientism idea is really just to focus on the boundary and say, look, every sentient being warrants our compassion. And some people do push for a more egalitarian stance, which says, look, every sentient being should matter equally. Although even those people, I think, really struggle in some thought experiments, as you can imagine. But most people, I think almost everybody, ultimately still has some form of prioritization and structure and hierarchy within that. The thing I'm suggesting is that, okay, prioritize in different ways. We're going to do that, right? I prioritize my family over even other humans. But our scope of compassion is still clear, right? Every sentient being warrants compassion such that we wouldn't needlessly harm or kill them. So that boundary setting to me is really important. But it does not mean there aren't going to be difficult situations and awkward ethical trade-offs. There's no perfection to be had. But setting that boundary seems important to me, because as soon as any sentient being is excluded from moral consideration, that basically means anything goes, right? We can harm or kill them with complete impunity because then they're like a rock or a glass, right? So that exclusion is the risk. Yeah.
What about harm or kill? I mean, that seems like a narrow
Well,
scope there.
I think that's an absolutely minimal baseline, because
Okay.
I think that's the minimum. If someone said, look, I have moral consideration for you, I have compassion for you, I care about you, the absolute minimum you'd expect from them is not to be harmed or killed, right? So I'm suggesting that as a minimal baseline.
Okay, good.
But ideally, we'd go way beyond that and help and assist and support and encourage flourishing and help other beings live good lives too, right? So I'm just sort of suggesting the absolute baseline that we shouldn't go underneath, really. But
Because harm, I my feelings about how we should treat animals have evolved, and I even worry that the way that I mean, people look at me like I'm crazy, but I'm not crazy about dogs being on leashes. But then people say, well, they'll get hit by cars. And I say, well, maybe if we started prioritizing that animals be more free to do what they want and not be always either in a house where alone most of the time if you work, or 10 minutes on a leash being pulled along, not really allowed to be free. Maybe if we started really prioritizing that, maybe we'd change a lot about our society. It means monumental. That's one of the reasons that our laws aren't giving animals rights, because people are so afraid. And I understand why. It would change our society so much if we really had to give legally animals certain rights.
yeah, and I think it often works backwards, right? Because people have this deep intuition that the way we've always done things is right because we're good people, so the things we do must be good. There's this fear of change, particularly radical change, and that leads them to exclude other beings from moral consideration. Whereas I think what we need to do is do what you're doing, which is be brave enough to work the other way around and say, look, I'm not suggesting we're going to have a perfect, easy answer here, but there's no reason to withdraw our compassion from these sentient beings. Let's look with clear eyes at the implications and work them through. And it may well be a struggle, it may be difficult, and we might not know what to do, but at least establishing that universal compassion has to be the starting point, not something we reverse engineer to justify what we wanted to do in the first place.
I mean, there are a lot of places where dogs run around. I've been to islands and things where dogs run around in the street and they run in packs, and then they go, a lot of them don't look quote unquote healthy. They have, ticks and fleas, and they aren't fed as well as are. But on balance, are they maybe happier than our dogs? Maybe they're not as clean, and they're not as safe, and they're not as fed. Okay. But they have other things that we don't really take into consideration, but we've just put our own values on the dog, basically.
Yeah. And maybe their freedom is worth more to them than comfort, or, I mean, it's difficult to tell. But to be honest, we have these challenges even with the intrahuman ethics too, right? Freedom from suffering, constraints, interests clashing against each other. It's difficult. And I think the best we can do is try to genuinely take the perspective of the other, and we'll get it wrong and we'll misunderstand, and particularly across the species boundary, that's tough as well, right? But I'm not sure there's more we can do really, but try and do that in a good faith way.
In the 80s, there was discussion about boycotting South Africa because of South Africa's governmental apartheid system. And the argument against the boycott was that it would hurt the economy. Therefore, it would hurt the people of color in South Africa. So that was the argument to and fro. And I remember somebody saying, just ask the South Africans what they want. They would have wanted us to boycott them. So that a lot of times we can get rid of our moral dilemma if we just ask the people we're trying, or the beings we're really trying. Yeah, ask the beings we're trying to help what they want.
Yeah, agree. So we've answered the first question about what's real with, I think we both share a sort of broadly naturalistic way of understanding the world, use evidence and reason, have some humility and try to work stuff out. I think we also share this sort of moral scope that includes all sentient beings. Any being that can suffer matters to us, or will no doubt prioritize in different ways as well. But in that context, that cues us up for the final big question, which is how can we make a better future? Again, crazily broad, one, I'm interested in your sort of whether you've got a big picture view of how we can make a better future, whether you have a utopian vision we can push towards, or a sort of theory of change about how we make all this stuff happen. But of course, I'm also particularly interested in the activism you do yourself, and most recently that includes the investigation work you've done and animal rescue work too, and how that fits into trying to make positive change happen. So you can, either dive into that or start with any sort of big picture thoughts about how can we make a better world from the long history you have of a broad range of types of activism.
I think the basis is that humans have to stop thinking that we're the center and that the whole planet should serve us. And we have to start with that by stopping, how we have to stop procreating like we're procreating, because our population has gotten so large that we are taking over all natural things and to survive. When I was born, there were only 3 billion people on the planet, and now there are 8 billion, and we're going to go up to 10 billion at the rate at which we're procreating. And by the way, when I say, I'm not saying for us to stop procreating, I'm just saying, hey, everybody, Western countries where the birth rates are lower even, or countries in the South where they're higher, everybody needs to have fewer kids, because the people in the West, who, even though we have smaller families, we are so much more destructive and greedy, taking the resources of the planet. So that to me is so fundamental and so not accepted. I mean, most people won't talk to me about it. Journalists won't make the link because they're so uncomfortable. Yet humans are able to see when there are deer populations that get too much, and they say, well, we've got to hunt the deer because there's too many of them and they'll starve. And that's suffering for the deer. And then they'll say, the beetle population has gotten too big and there's an imbalance. And there's all these imbalances of even plants, plants overtake this, and we've got to start. And we don't see it in ourselves because of our speciesism and anthropocentrism, and also probably a lot about religion, which tells a lot of people to go forth and multiply. And of course, that was said in the Christian Bible 2,000 years ago. And yeah, maybe then it was a good idea, but now it's not. So we do have to adjust. And we do adjust so much about what's in the Bible. We don't adjust that message, which I think is so fundamental, because the more desperate, remember we talked about luck and how our circumstances often determine how good a person, how ethical a person we can be. The bigger our population, the less ethical and generous we'll be able to be to other species on this planet and to nature.
And it's a tricky topic. I've talked to Nandita Bajaj and Carter Dillard, both who've worked with population balance, and they've had some fascinating conversations there. And it's a difficult topic, partly because there are some quite dark parts of the population agenda, and some people suggesting things that go beyond what I would consider ethical and quite radical paths forward. So my personal stance, I'm quite comfortable with the concern about planetary boundaries and resource utilization, and I can see that. I'm very positive about the types of intervention that tend to reduce birth rates through
coercion. That never works.
Yeah, exactly. So
it doesn't work. But let me say, Jamie, that people bring this up and they use that as an excuse not to deal with the issue at all. But even if you talk about, for example, voting rights, let's say, which is something I was involved with to register people to vote for 18 years. I registered every week people on street corners in LA. You could come up to me and say, oh, well, the country of so-and-so, they rigged their voting. And so that was really bad. We really shouldn't have voting. I mean, that is such baloney. Yet people do that with the population issue so often. It drives me crazy because, of course, Carter Dillard and Nandita and myself, we don't want people to suffer. We're all vegans, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So we want it to be done.
It's driven from compassion.
Humane. And yet everyone brings this thing. I'm scared about that. Well, yeah. So are we. We would never want that. That's why just like there's always a dark side to everything, but everyone weights it so heavily when those were things that we've learned from. And the Chinese started their one-child birth policy because they were so desperate not to have 400 million people starve to death. And yes, they did it wrong because Iran lowered its birth rate by just as much without any coercion at all. By the way, bringing in the religious clerics and things to join. And the religious clerics were all on board with women not having as many kids, and it worked beautifully. So they really integrate it. But so I just want to say that when we bring up this conversation, people will bring up always this negativity instead of really diving deep into the possibilities of having fewer kids and the positivity, which I know Nandita talked to you about. So everybody go back to that show because I'm sure it's good. And Carter is super smart. Anyway, so there, I'm going to get off my rant, but that's what everyone brings up to kind of shut down the conversation. Like no one's ever made a mistake on any issue. And that means, it's crazy. Every issue has a dark side.
Yeah, it should not make the issue a taboo issue at all. We should look at it with clear eyes and think it through and have everything we do driven by compassion. I agree with you. I think there are still a couple of other issues that we do need to work through. And one is the classic demographic structure, because in the economic systems we've got, you need a certain proportion of the working population to be able to fund retirement, for example. And as that shifts, that can be difficult. Is that an insurmountable problem? Probably not, but you probably do need some very radical redistributive policy to go along with that to make sure the transition works. But it could be worked through.
Okay, yes.
But
it has to be worked through because look at this Ponzi scheme we're doing to just avoid some economic construct that we've constructed ourselves to avoid a blip in that. Yes, there will be definitely years we'll be like, oh, wish I had more young people to earn money so that we can give a retirement fund for the old people. However, with AI, there's going to be so many more people out of work anyway. We're probably going to have to move to some kind of minimum wage distributed by governments. But yes, there's no doubt that that's an issue.
And some think that AI could actually provide the productivity that we'd be missing from the younger demographic, maybe.
And it's going to be, AI is here and it's already putting people out of work. We see that all the time when we just go to a parking lot and there's nobody to give your ticket to. You've got to do it to a machine or, a million things we all know. So yes, that economic thing. But what astounds me is that economists don't talk about the fact that 0 to 18, those human beings 0 to 18 are not productive. They're sucking out stuff from the economy. Whereas, and I know this because, I'm 60, my mom's 87, we pay taxes, we volunteer, a lot of us work. So this idea that people who are over 65 are suddenly a huge draw on the economy. Yes, they are, but they're not maybe as much as the young people. I don't know because I haven't done that calculation, but we seem to conveniently forget that. And another thing we forget is this Ponzi scheme, that the economy is going to be terrible when we have no more trees to cut down, no more clean rivers, that there's too much traffic. I could go on and on, but I would love to talk. I'm not an economist. I never even went to college, but I want to have a conversation with an economist with a PhD from Yale or Harvard, because I believe they are myopic when it comes to this issue. It will definitely hurt people. It won't hurt this construct called the economy, which will be very busy and everything, but it will hurt beings when we have 10 billion people on the planet, because there have been studies done that even if a GDP is high, the country's doing well, it doesn't mean that the people are doing well. The fastest growing GDPs are in some of the countries in Asia and Africa, and those folks they're not doing that well.
Yeah, GDP per capita it's a strong indicator, but it's not the only thing. Right? It's not the same thing as happiness and well-being. And there is also a possibility that shift in population dynamics, which to a degree seems to be happening anyway, because birth rates are slowing, and people are now projecting that 10 and a bit might even be the peak, and after that we're coming down anyway. So is that one thing is whether it might actually change the debate around migration and immigration, because actually if you're sort of ethno-nationalist right-wing conservative government telling people to have babies. That's crazy, right? Because you won't get the investment for another 20 years. Whereas if migrants come in who are already adults and ready to work, even from a purely economic standpoint, maybe you will move away from a position where people are sort of being aggressive and unpleasant about migrants, and different nations are actually starting to fight to attract them and draw them in. And I don't know if there could be another sort of potential positive spin-off from that. Well, people will start to appreciate people when they're a little bit more scarce. I don't know.
I would hope so. I mean, I find it fascinating that people who insist have pronatalist policies, like have more babies, like, for example, Hungary, that we're not looking at that as incredibly racist. And instead, people look at people like me as racist because I'm saying, hey, we all need to have fewer babies so our children and grandchildren can have a better life, and the animals can have a better life too. But those people who are encouraging births are actually racist because they don't want to bring anybody else into their
country. Want the right sort of people, right? That's exactly. The right sort of people, yeah. So the final thing on the population thing is, which will bring us back to the animal question, is when you look at the sort of land use stats and the way we're busting planetary boundaries and the resource use and the pollution and all of the other things we're doing, it seems to me that, obviously there's a big chunk of that which is driven by fossil fuels and by consumption patterns and by global industries. But obviously a big chunk of that is animal agriculture itself. And maybe I have this naive hope that if we can shift radically to a completely plant-based agricultural system, things like that would free up 3/4 of all of our agricultural land, 3 billion hectares, I think it is, and have all the other knock-on impacts like water use and so on. When I think about the population problem, I guess I zero more in on the 100 billion land animals than I do on the 10 billion humans. And if we can fix that problem, maybe the planet would actually have plenty of carrying capacity for 10, 11 billion humans, which is the most we'll ever need. Are you convinced by that, or do you think we need to do both at once? Yeah.
We need to do both, and I'll tell you why. Because, for example, I drive an electric car. I've been driving electric cars since 1990.
Early adopter.
Yes, very early adopter. And they're good. They will help us not drill as much oil. However, electric cars take cobalt and all sorts of minerals and rare earth minerals and stuff, and that damages the planet. What is one of the most needed resources on this planet, the most depleted, is sand. Sand to build all the houses. So it's not just food. And when we look at food, we're also looking at it in a very anthropocentric way, like, okay, well, we'll have enough food. But we're going to still be building and taking nature away. And when you think about the 10 billion, billions and billions of land animals and the 8 billion to 10 billion people, there's still the wildlife, which is only 4% of our mammalian biomass is wildlife. I think it's something like 62% is livestock and 36% is humans. And then there's a 42% for wildlife. So yeah, I want to definitely make the world better for humans, but I think we also have an eye to making it have, there would be resources for animals.
Well, let me draw you back to the animal question now as well, because I'm really interested in the work you do with DXE around investigations and rescue and so on. And I wonder if you would mind sort of just telling us the potted story of the recent trial and how that's played out. But particularly, how do you think that type of work is going to help us change things? How do you think it plays into making a difference?
So Direct Action Everywhere, also known as DXE, is a grassroots organization that has chapters all around the world. And one of the focuses of our work is to do investigations into places where animals are abused, undercover investigations, where you would never get that kind of knowledge or footage from government sources or law enforcement agencies or the corporations themselves. And we often rescue the animals inside. And so the animal investigations are done usually undercover. I've done many of them with Direct Action Everywhere. And they're usually on farms now, mostly because laboratories are so hard to get into now. And the animal rights movement was concentrated on laboratories in the 80s and 90s, but they shut down. And you can still walk onto farms and open up doors and see animals and things like that. So farms are easier to get into. And plus there's millions and millions of animals being tested on. It's terrible. The bottom line is that people only see this footage because activists take pictures of it. Otherwise, we would know nothing about what happens to animals in labs or laboratories or in factory farms. So activists are an important part of changing the world, even we so-called extreme activists.
So that transparency is part of it, just showing people what's going on with the videos and with the bearing witness. Yeah.
We show what's going on, but then we're transparent ourselves in that we admit we don't hide our faces if we are in the video. We don't deny that we've been there or anything. And when we rescue an animal, we tell a story about that animal. We know we cannot rescue billions. There aren't enough sanctuaries there's very few sanctuaries. So we rescue one or two or, maybe up to 50 if they're smaller, like hens and things. And we document their story so that people can see these animals as individuals, not as just chickens, faceless chickens. It's hard for humans to really see pain and suffering or understand that animals have emotions when they haven't had a personal experience with one. That's why we have a hierarchy, which our cats and our dogs, we'd be horrified if someone brought them into a lab. And we hate to hear about dogs being tested on. But if it's a pig or, an insect, a worm, or a fish, we don't relate to it. So we kind of shut out that part of us that could empathize. So that's why it's so important to make these videos about the rescue. So we show where they came from, each animal, and how they thrive when they're in an environment that is more conducive to their natural behavior and respects them as individuals.
And I think that's another really important aspect of it, because one of the challenges with the footage in the farms is that it's often so horrific that I think people disassociate from the animals as a self-defense mechanism, where if you actually show them the possibility of their natural lives and see these animals in social groups and enjoying life, and that's a very different dynamic, isn't it?
Yes, I remember when I was still vegetarian, I was watching a video made by Mercy for Animals, and farmers were beating calves. And I was weeping, like vocally weeping as I sat, but I forced myself to watch it because my friend Karen Dawn said, if you drink milk or eat dairy products, you need to watch this. So I thought, okay, I'm going to watch it. And it was really hard. And guess what? 4 hours later, I got a frozen yogurt. I somehow was able to separate and justify and et cetera, et cetera. So I understand why people can even see these videos and still go eat meat. It's nicely packaged and stuff. If they had to kill their own meat or go, if they went to the slaughterhouse in person, maybe they would feel differently. But it still helps, makes a difference, and helps us break down those cultural messages that we get constantly, that it's okay to treat animals differently, and that animals somehow aren't suffering, or whatever we use to justify. So these videos help slowly break down those walls.
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely central, is that, as it is in intrahuman ethics, right? Trying to take the perspective of the other and genuinely, as far as you can, really try to identify with that and care about it. It's that simple.
Or replace your cat or dog or beloved pet in the place of this nameless chicken or pig or calf or cow that's on a factory farm, and see if you would allow your animals to go through what they go through.
Yeah, exactly. And you've been arrested quite a few times. What do you think is the role of, I guess, the law and the courts and that type of activism, where you're willing to get arrested, you're willing to be taken to court, you're willing to go through a trial? What role do you think that can play in shifting public consciousness?
Yeah, I have been arrested over 20 times, actually, for peaceful civil disobedience or rescues. And I believe it's important. I believe it's important to go to the courts too, and not try and get out of whatever deal that they want to, the government or the farm or whoever wants to make with you. But some people can't do that because they have children and jobs and things like that. So you go as far as you can so that your life isn't completely turned upside down, because we need everyone to be activists. We don't need them to, have their life fall apart, and then they can't even be an activist either. I am fortunate in that I was an actress for 41 years, where if you get arrested because you're protesting the crushing of electric cars, Hollywood does not mind. They go, oh, thank God you didn't, you weren't caught for snorting cocaine or drunk driving, So it's nothing, small potatoes for them.
Yeah.
So but a lot of people have jobs where they can't get arrested, even have a misdemeanor. So I have the financial means that if I can't work for a little bit, then I'm okay. And I have a husband who supports me. I don't have children to take care of. So many things allow me to be this kind of activist. You don't have to be this kind of activist. All sorts of activists are important. And I think for those of us who can, it's important for us to go through the courts, because we need to have legal rights for animals. And they don't have them, which is why Alicia Santurio, my co-defendant, and I, when we rescued these 2 chickens off a slaughterhouse truck, we refused, I think it was 5 deals that they want to offer us, which entailed no jail time. Really, they were nothing. I think once I had to pay, maybe they said $45. We said no, because we feel that Jax and Ethan, the chickens we rescued, deserve to have their stories heard. And the court of public opinion pretty much agrees with us, but the court of law does not protect these animals at all, which is why we had to go in there instead of Jax and Ethan. We're their proxies, essentially. And I hope that one day we were acquitted, not because of anything to do with Jax and Ethan, unfortunately. And I hope that one day we would be acquitted, or Jax and Ethan would be able to be in court because of what's being done to them, and not because of some loophole in the laws made by man, or some, financial issue, which is one of the reasons we were acquitted. That has to do with the corporation and their finances. So it's really important that we keep moving the courts forward. This was a win, but even if we'd lost, it would have been fine, because the more the courts hear these cases, the more maybe one day they will look at Ethan and Jax and chickens and other animals like them and deem them worthy of having some rights themselves.
Yeah. And everything you do is nudging things that way. And I get your point that, not everybody can make those types of commitments, but it doesn't undermine the seriousness of the commitment you've made through that form of activism. So yeah, impressive. Thank you. So the final thing, I'm going to let you go in a minute. I wanted to come back to your health coaching expertise, if you don't mind, because when we're helping individuals make personal changes towards plant-based diets and towards boycotting products of animal agriculture, often health is used as an excuse, frankly. And it's a convenient excuse because it's one that we understandably don't want to challenge, because it's a private issue and there may well be genuine issues there. But there are also genuine blockers and genuine issues that people have around health and diet as well that we need to respect and accord consideration to. And that might be around access to foods, it might be around skills, it might be to do with eating disorders, it might be to do with genuine medical issues where they struggle to get the right nutrients and so on. So in that sort of complex, messy context, how do you help people who want to make those sorts of changes work their way through that stuff? Have you got any sort of general top-level guidance for someone who's trying to move towards a vegan diet?
So I didn't become a health coach to try and get people to go plant-based. I became a health coach because I had struggled with body image and food in my teens and 20s. I was anorexic and bulimic for 12 years.
Oh, wow.
And yeah. I wanted people, I thought I would have mostly women clients, but I actually end up being mostly half and half, women and men generally. But I wanted people to feel better about themselves. And I know that for me, when I was able to get a handle on eating healthily and appreciating how I look, my body, and that it was the body I felt I wanted to be in, that changed so much else in my life. So that was why I became a health coach. Had nothing to do with, I was already vegan, but as a coach, we coach. I do not tell people how to eat. So most of my clients eat meat. I don't tell them not to. My job is to find out what they want and move them forward. My ethics, here's where my ethics, I could never tell somebody have some chicken. So I would always you couch it either with protein, and I would always say most people, if they ate more vegetables and fruit and whole foods, would solve so many of their issues anyway. So, and I was pretty easy to say, don't drink milk. It's just bad for you. I'm not a nutritionist, see, so I have very strict parameters on how I can guide clients. And I was respectful of those. And so a coach doesn't tell somebody what to do. We guide them and let them find the answers. But having said that, the best way to encourage someone to do what's best for them, and I of course believe that's a vegan diet. And pretty much all of them know that more vegetables, more fruit, more beans, nuts, seeds are better for you, and had an idea that they knew that milk and dairy were not that healthy, frankly. But there's other issues too. There's processed foods, which can be vegan. So the best way is to find out what they want ultimately and guide and let them find the answers for themselves. And that's what I would work on. And if they had an explicit question, of course I would answer, but I would always say, I'm not a nutritionist. I'll send you some information, and I would send them follow-up information. So, but what I found in just working with our podcast, Switch for Good, which does advocate for a plant-based diet, because as a health coach, I didn't advocate for, you had to have a plant-based diet, is to find out what they're already doing right. And we do this as coaches. What are you already doing right, and build on that? And so a lot of times it was the vegetables and the fruits and the whole foods, and you build on that. And eating plant-based is so much different than being a vegan, an ethical vegan. So it's a completely different sphere and mindset.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Yeah. Well, that's been brilliant. Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating exploration of your philosophy and your activism and your thinking in so many different areas. We've covered an enormous amount of ground in an hour and a half. So thank you for being so generous with your time. Is there anything else you'd like to add into the conversation before I let you go? And also, how can people follow you, keep up to date with your work, subscribe to Switch for Good, your own podcast? I believe you've got a new film project coming out soon as well.
This came out actually. So, well, I'm not great on social media, folks, but you can follow me at alexandrapaul.com. I have a website if you want to learn more about me. And then I got off Twitter because of ethical reasons. When Elon Musk decided that our national public radio was some kind of communist plot, I decided, you know what, I think I'm going to get off Twitter now.
Yeah.
So you can follow me on Instagram, which is Alexandra_actress, and Facebook, which is official Alexandra Paul official, and at Switch for Good, which would be switchforgood.org, would be switch, then the digit 4 and good.org/podcast if you want to learn more about our podcast, or we're on every single podcast platform out there.
It's a great listen.
Thank you so much.
No, it's brilliant. Thank you. And you could probably hear Luna in the background saying goodbye as well. So that's probably a sign we've gone on too long. Thank you again for spending so much time with me. It's been a real pleasure to have you on Sentientist Conversations, and kudos for all your amazing heartfelt activism. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you.